So why does climate change matter? We have a very programmatic view of climate change at EPA in that many of the outcomes that we're charged with delivering to the American people, and in particular that we're charged in delivering in partnership with states and tribes and local communities, like clean air, safe drinking water, in conjunction with economic growth, depend upon or are sensitive to changes in climate. And so up until this point, it's been a pretty fair assumption. You design something like a stormwater control measure or something like that, for the rainfall that you've had in the last decade, and that would work pretty well going forward. But that, what the scientists call an assumption of stationarity, the assumption that things are going to be the same, is really not any longer a good predictor of what we're likely to see in the future. And so EPA needs to adapt, and as a matter of smart government, think about what climate change means for the work that we're doing and the work we're doing in partnership with communities. And so this is just a quick rundown of some of the major areas, and I'll get to some products where you can see a longer list. But if you think about water, you can think about increased risk of sewer overflows and overflows at wastewater bypasses. You can think about the integrity of coastal water infrastructure systems that can be put at risk, saltwater intrusion in surface water and groundwater that can place increased demands on drinking water treatment. You can also think about increased severe rainstorms and floods leading to increased pollutant loads to water bodies that can then increase, sorry for the lingo, water treatment costs. I should say, if I do the DC thing and run into an acronym that is unfamiliar, please stick up your hand and I can correct it. That's Publicly Operated Treatment Works. Air impacts, a major one that a lot of people talk about is increased tropospheric ozone pollution. So if you have more warmer days, that drives atmospheric chemistry faster, and it can make it more difficult to achieve, the air quality standards that we set. So we set health-based standards. We want to make sure that people are able to meet those. Cleanup of contaminated sites and waste management. So things like floods and sea level rise can enter contaminated sites, and that can be a real problem. You compound a contamination issue with then a cleanup issue or the release of that contamination into the environment. And then obviously EPA facilities and operations, we have buildings as the federal government, and we need to be mindful of the impacts of climate change on those. There's other things that aren't on this list. So for example, pesticides is an area where you might sort of start the conversation and think, well, what's the link there? But you can think about movements in pest populations. You can also think that the models that we use to examine pesticides assume things about what the climate's going to be like, because when you spray a pesticide or apply it, the environmental conditions can influence how they spread. So really what we're trying to do at EPA is mainstream our considerations of climate change into the work that we're doing, including our programs, our policies, our rules and operations, to make sure that those policies are effective even as the climate changes. And so there's a bunch of sort of structures at the federal government that have really been driving and shaping this work. One of them is the President's Climate Action Plan, which came out on a very hot day in June in 2013. Most of you may be familiar with this, but it's got three parts. Cutting carbon pollution, so that's your mitigation. Section 3 is working at the international level cooperatively to address the global problem. And then Section 2, which maybe gets a little bit less of the press coverage, but is also very important, is preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change. And so we've been undertaking a number of actions under the Climate Action Plan. There's also an executive order that followed out of that, preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change. And so the president charged federal agencies with really stepping up their game in this space. And it led to a bunch of mechanisms, including supporting more climate resilient investments in communities across the country, really focusing on providing states, tribes, and local communities with the information, data, tools, and training they need to increase resilience and prepare for climate change, recognizing that a lot of this work, as the previous speakers have mentioned, happens at the local level. These are decisions that are made at the local scale or at the regional scale or by state governments. And so we want to play as the federal government as a partner in that and provide information to help make good decisions. And then third, federal agency planning for climate change related risk. And it charged every federal department and agency required to, with producing a climate adaptation plan. And so here's our climate adaptation plan. It's up on the website, and it really goes program by program and talks about how we think about the intersection of climate change with with our work. And I should also emphasize that we're not the only federal agency that has a climate adaptation plan. So if you're doing work thinking about other federal agencies and climate change, chances are they also have a plan, and so you could take a look at those. They should all be up on the internet. But because we love thinking about climate adaptation at the agency, we've also gone one step further, and we've developed program and regional office implementation plans. So the Office of Air, Water, Solid Waste, they all have their own plan that goes into much more detail. And also all the regional offices. David's here from Region 7 in the back in case we get St. Louis questions. So they have much more detailed recommendations that are really tailored because these are regional issues, right? The adaptation issues in the Northeast are not the adaptation issues in the Southwest. And so you add these up, and there's probably, I don't know, probably on the high side of 500 individual points that we're sort of trying to work forward on at EPA as we bring adaptation in more fully and effectively into our work. And then the last one I just want to flag, because I came from a panel on this about 20 minutes ago, is the White House Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resilience. So this was a task force established by the executive order, and it convened a bunch of local government officials from all over the country to ask them what the federal government should be doing in order to help them deal with climate change issues. And so you can see the list here, 26 governor, mayors, and tribal leaders and county officials. And they issued a 49-page report with a bunch of recommendations. And then the federal government actually didn't even wait for the report to come out, started working in advance of the release. And so on the same day, a bunch of agencies teamed up to release a bunch of steps, including this website that I'll come back to called toolkit.climate.gov. So that's a lot of different guiding documents, and I was thinking about a framework to sort of bring this into buckets that make a little bit more sense and are a little bit less bureaucratic. And basically, the idea here is that we're interested in strengthening the adaptive capacity of both the agency and the people we work with. So we want our staff to feel empowered to work with our partners and engage on climate issues to make smart decisions. And we also want to make sure that our partners in states, tribes, and local communities and other groups have the information they need to make smart investments and good choices. And we're doing this in sort of three large categories of tasks. The first is training. So we're working to increase awareness of the ways in which climate change impacts people and their ability to do the things that they're already trying to do, right? Because this isn't really about new issues. This is about your town already wants clean water or is already thinking about replacing a treatment plant, a water treatment plant, and how does climate inform that decision? Second is financial incentives. So we're thinking about how we can support climate resilient investments. And then the third major area is tools, helping people get the data and information and tools. I think you probably already encountered that there's a lot of science out there, and covering the distance between the original peer-reviewed research and something that someone at the local government level can use or a community level can use is a big challenge. And so we're working to try and close that gap. All about empowering communities. All right. Let's see. So training is the first thing I want to talk about. And we're doing a bunch of work in this area, some of it very technical, but one that's worth highlighting, which we actually just rolled out last week, is this climate change adaptation introductory training for local governments. We heard this from the task force. They said, gee, wouldn't it be great if we had something that we could give to the people that work in our local governments or other mayors that I know, they could just get them acquainted with these issues. So a basic sort of climate adaptation 101 training. And we went to our EPA has its own local government advisory committee. We asked them for advice on what would really be useful to them as they had these conversations. And so we pulled together this training. And it includes some examples of local governments and communities that have already deployed some resilience strategies, and then helps to point people to resources to help local governments get started. And if you want to go take a look at it, it's at www.epa.gov local adaptation training. So this was another big victory for the federal government, establishing a URL that everyone can remember. And I'll also leave behind, there's a little flyer about it here that I'm happy to leave in case people don't want to type down the whole thing. So that's that one. And I'll just mention for Bob's sake that there is also a tribal government and tribal component to the training. There's a little video embedded in there. So the second area is is supporting climate resilient investments. And this is really about smart government. We have limited resources at EPA to support support communities and local governments doing the kinds of things that they need to do with their water infrastructure, brownfields, cleanups, those kinds of things. And so this is about making sure that when we are expending those dollars, we're doing it in a smart way, and we're not putting a bunch of resources into rebuilding a treatment plant that's going to get flooded and destroyed and damaged and have to be replaced again, right? That's not, in a world of limited resources, that's just not something that it's a good idea to do. So we've been slowly working our way through and really trying to weave climate considerations into a bunch of different funding sources to sort of start these conversations about how climate change impacts how the funds are used. So within our clean water and drinking water state revolving loan funds, folks may know these are a major source of resources to states and local governments for dealing with water infrastructure, wetlands, things like that. And we're in fact working with California on a pilot to really target underserved communities and think about their water infrastructure needs with a particular eye to climate change. So we're doing some work on that. In the brownfield space, this is another area where you want to think about, if you're doing a brownfield cleanup, is that cleanup still going to be effective in an environment where there might be more flooding in the region or there might be sea level rise? So we've been doing work there, and also trying to make sure that it takes in a whole bunch of other considerations. So we did some work that's mentioned in the training with Chester, Pennsylvania. They'd had some real problems with flooding that you would expect given climate projections to get worse. So they were thinking about how to deal with the flooding, but they were also looking for co-benefits for the community. So they looked at green infrastructure as a way to sort of increase natural values in the community, and also provide a way to sort of adaptively manage the flooding. So we're doing some work in that space. We've been doing a bunch of work in Region 2 to build climate resiliency into Hurricane Sandy recovery activities. And actually, even earlier, we did some work following Hurricane Irene. And I can come back to some examples in that space if people are interested. And then we've also been doing work in Region 5 through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to help people just start thinking about how climate change influences the kinds of projects that they're wanting to do. Let's see. And I guess the other thing that's not covered on this slide that I wanted to make sure I mentioned is that we're also, one of the things I've been really excited about actually is we've gotten a lot better at partnering with other federal agencies to make sure that multiple pots of money are getting combined in ways that are really effective for communities. So we have a booth out in the main hall for the partnership for the Office of Sustainable Communities at EPA. And they work through what's called the Partnership for Sustainable Communities with HUD and DOT, which is basically a recognition that you have these communities where in the downtown, EPA might be working to help people manage water quality, and HUD might be working with them on housing, and DOT might be working with them on the roads and the transportation infrastructure in the area, but it's the exact same place. And so the partnership represents this what should not be revolutionary concept that you should get all those people in a room and have them talk to each other about how we can really work together on these issues and find win-win solutions and pathways for federal governments to leverage a little bit of resources from a lot of agencies and whatever support they can get from the private sector or other public sources to really get to the outcome they're looking for their community. And increasingly, conversations about resiliency are part of that. Let's see. And then the last major area I wanted to touch on was decision support tools and resources. So at EPA and in the federal government generally, we have a lot of data and a lot of information. We also have a lot of subject matter experts, and we're trying to make that more accessible to people who are out in the field making decisions about climate change. And the master repository following the task force on this is toolkit.climate.gov. So if you haven't been, it's worth going to sort of surf around in there and take a look. As we develop new tools, we put them up on the toolkit. So the local adaptation training that we developed went on the toolkit the day we released it. But it represents tools not just from our agency and other ones. And the same thing for the climate data portal. That's an opportunity to make the information available, not just for us and our community partners, but also for the private sector, if they're interested in using it, to inform their decisions. And just to sort of give you one example of the kind of thing that we're doing in this space is the National Stormwater Calculator and Climate Assessment Tool Package. I can tell you're all really excited. So this is a really important issue. Lots of communities struggle with stormwater issues and stormwater flooding. And so we released this in January 30th, 2014, following on the President's Climate Action Plan. So the tool, as it stood, was already designed to basically allow you to take an area and think about the stormwater control measures that you were going to put in there. So there's the sort of what we would call the gray measures. These are things like pipes and concrete to handle the stormwater, but also green measures like various swales that can capture the water and allow it to infiltrate more gradually. And that's a very handy exercise to run, but in some ways it answers the wrong question, which is, how is this infrastructure going to manage flooding in the climate that we used to have, right? If you're making a big investment to deploy infrastructure, you want to ask the question, how is this infrastructure going to work for me in the climate it's going to be sitting around in, which in many communities, they're not wanting to come back to these kinds of things frequently. So if you're going to put in place measures that might be in place for 10 years or 20 years or 40 years, you want to think about the future climate. So we've given people the opportunity to look at a range of projected climate impacts to think about, okay, what happens if seasonal precipitation changes around, if you're getting more high intensity storms, if the evaporation rate is really changing, and allow them to sort of consider that information, not in a prescriptive way, but in a way that allows them to sort of balance those considerations across multiple designs. And we're thinking about other tools that we have and how we can add that sort of climate functionality onto them so that people are making better investments and better decisions. So I just want to finish by hammering home the point that adaptation is smart government. Climate adaptation helps us ensure that the investments that we're making in things like water infrastructure and that are made with scarce taxpayer dollars are effective even as the climate changes. It's also a way for us at the agency to work with communities to make sure that they're achieving their goals that we're helping them with, whether it be clean air or cleaning up contaminated sites. And I think that is probably all I wanted to say about that.